Hey everyone, welcome to Volume 3 of my How to Shmup series. I think this will be a unique entry into the series because rather than talking about specific in-game strategies like boss fights, bullet herding, routing, which will be the next video, we are going to be talking a little bit on the meta level here as far as mentality and training regimen and a little bit outside the game but also within the game, which is how do you break through a skill ceiling or a skill plateau or barrier, however you want to say it. Basically, how do you go from not being able to clear stage 3 to getting 1 all clears to maybe one day getting 2 all clears and high scores and all that good stuff? What is that process like? Because I think this is something that is going to be a reality for many players, no matter how skilled you are, even Jamers himself. We all run up against skill ceilings and skill barriers, and it's just the question of how high up basically on the totem pole. But each time you take a step up, you have to repeat the process of improvement. And so in this video, I want to try my best to give my advice on how I did that, at least with Dodonpachi, where I went from, really celebrating getting my 1 all. It felt like a huge undertaking, to getting a 2 all in that game. And as many people warned me in my quest to do so, the large jump in difficulty between a 1 all and 2 all cannot be overstated. I'd say a 2 all was 5 times harder, something like that, insanely, and a much higher degree in difficulty. And I remember when I first went on that journey of playing the second loop and stuff, especially when I started hitting those second loop bosses, I literally thought many times, this is straight up impossible, at least for me. I'm not good enough. I'll never be good enough. There's no conceivable way I can foresee myself beating this game. It seemed like an impossibility to me. And I'm really hoping in this video I can break down what I did to get there. That may also be helpful. So let's start with the beginning, which I think is just sort of recognizing what your skill ceiling is, because sometimes you can maybe underestimate yourself or overestimate yourself as far as what you're able to accomplish, especially if you're kind of newer to the genre and you haven't really gone really in depth on a game as far as trying to get a specific goal or stuff or something like that. So I think the first step to getting better overall is to find a goal that is outside your reach and to dedicate yourself to that goal. I think this is the first step, and the step that a lot of people have trouble making, actually, because as I will explain further on in this video, that part of the quest is not necessarily as fun as sort of touring your way through different games. If you're fairly experienced, like collecting 1 alls and things like that, which there's no denying that is actually pretty fun to do. I myself will enjoy doing that from time to time, take a break from the long grind sessions to do some 1 all, collecting and stuff like that. However, I think the importance is that even though that is fun to do, I do want to stress that if that's how you want to play, that's fine. I'm not going to give you a hard time about it. I don't think we all need to be snooty elitists about those sorts of things. But if you're feeling like you want to go further and deeper in the genre, I really do think that the first step is you need to find that game, that shmup, basically the shmup you can see yourself playing for hundreds and hundreds of hours, and then dedicating yourself to a specific goal in that you find to be significant and important and that you find yourself invested in. But before we go down this specific advice and stuff too far, I also want to point out some resources to you guys that were extremely helpful to me, not only for knowledge and information, but also a little bit of motivational reading and things like that. So the first thing I want to point out to everyone is a guide made by Prometheus, written 10 years ago now, which is Full Extent of the Jam. You may or may not be familiar with this. For me, this was like the Shmup Bible. When I was playing Dodonpachi and I was feeling stuck and I was feeling like, oh, I don't know if I can keep going, I would go through and read through Full Extent of the Jam, especially the part where he talks about learning Dodonpachi and stuff like that. It's a really cool sort of little guidebook because the first half is sort of about the basics of the genre, explaining all these different concepts of the genre, which I think will be a nice companion to the How to Shmup series. And then the second half is also his personal story of getting good at Dodonpachi, which I found very inspirational and helpful. So definitely check that out. I'll put a link in the description, of course. And then the second thing I want to point out to you is an article that Juju Kenobi created for my website. I used to do this series, I might do it again in the future, called Shmup Spotlight, where I would go to people who had recently accomplished things in Shmups and have them write up an article, and I'd help edit it and stuff, kind of talking about their experience. And Juju Kenobi wrote this amazing article called The Student of STG, and it's like Full Extent the Gem. I kind of think of it like a little bit of a spiritual successor to that. So the first bit is about how he got into Shmups, and it sort of breaks down how methodical of a player he is, kind of even before playing Shmups. And then the second half is specifically talking about how he got into Toho, how he learns Shmups, how he routes Shmups, and he did get a 2-all in Dodonpachi. He got a 2-all in DOJ. I mean, this guy is a really, really strong player, and he's made insane progress in Dodonpachi in a very short amount of time. I'm very jealous of his ability to play Shmups and his ability to learn routing so precisely. Also check out his channel. I'll link that as well, because he has a guide, a chaining guide on DOJ, and you can learn a lot from that even if you don't specifically play DOJ. So those are the two things I wanted to recommend to people to check out. So let's get back to what I advise the steps for improving at the genre overall. So one thing you need to keep in mind is that as you go through and improve at the genre overall, you're also going to need to key in to learning specific things, like I'm pointing out in this series, like how to learn boss fights better, how to learn routing better, which will be the next video, how you control bullets on the screen and all that sort of stuff, which I go over in the first video. All those things are still stuff you need to be mindful of and to practice and think about. But I want to talk about, with that sort of established, now what do you do as far as your practice routine, your out-of-game behavior? Because I think this is where a lot of players really struggle and end up quitting or leaving or feeling stuck. I think a lot of people get sort of stuck in this hole of, yes, I can get a 1-all, but I cannot ever imagine myself getting beyond that. Or I can get through stage 3, but I can't see myself really getting a 1-all or a 1cc, just because there's so many skill barriers in the way. And so I think the first thing to start is we need to have a more realistic understanding and sort of mental picture of how skill progression in this genre works. I think you'll find it similar to other things in life, right? Like playing instruments, playing sports, playing fighting games, all those sorts of things. It's pretty similar, but I think Shmups are unique in that they are extremely memorization heavy for the most part, pattern recognition heavy, and they really do require a good amount of exposure. Even if you are an extremely talented player, you are still going to need to sink those hours in. And I know a lot of people, I've talked about this before, people will point out players like Jamers who are able to pick up a game extremely quickly, learn it extremely quickly, and play better than pretty much the rest of us in a very short amount of time. And people have a real hard time with understanding how that works. I mean, Jamers is a shmup genius, obviously, but beyond that, another thing to keep in mind is Jamers has put who knows how many thousands, 100,000s, 10,000s, I don't know, somewhere in there, of hours into this genre. And so his brain has a sort of shorthand for pattern recognition and stuff like that. Once you become, and I'm starting to kind of build this up myself, which is really refreshing to feel finally, where I'll be playing a game for the first time and I'll be introduced to patterns, and I'll already be familiar with sort of the underlying mechanics of the patterns because of my exposure in other games and things like that. And so that is really useful. But one thing to keep in mind is that we need to be realistic about how much time you're going to need to put into the genre, because it is not, unfortunately, shmups are not a pick up and now you're good, you know, if you're talented type genre. You really do need to put in those hours, even if you are a really high skill level player. Another thing I think to point out, at least in my experience, this is how it's gone for me, is what skill progression in Shmups actually looks like and feels like, because I think if people have a little bit of a better understanding of what this process is sort of like internally, people will get less discouraged or have a little bit more patience. And so my analogy that I came up with here, and I'm sure you all admire my Picasso level artistic skills when it comes to creating visual representations, but so I wanted to create this little metaphor and analogy, which is improving at shmup is like breaking out of a glass jail cell or prison. I think that's a good way to think about it. And so what do I mean by breaking out of a glass prison? Well, the thing about glass is, for the most part, don't get too literal with this, right? For the most part, when you're trying to break glass, when you're hitting glass but you don't have enough strength, like you're trying to punch in your car door window and stuff, a lot of the times the glass, if you're not hitting it with enough strength, the glass doesn't show any sort of signs of damage or wear, and it doesn't really feel like you're doing anything, right? If you're just punching some like plexiglass or something and it's just way stronger than you, it doesn't do anything. It just sits there and your hands hurt and stuff like that. I think that's what it feels like when you're playing shmups, where the skill level of the game is a bit beyond your skill. It feels like you're punching at the game over and over and over, but you're not making any sort of dent or damage, and so it feels literally impossible to get out. However, the way to think about this analogy is, I think what you need to do is you need to punch that glass for a consistent amount of time and a consistent frequency to the point where you gain strength in your arm. So you need to punch that glass for a day, but you're not going to get stronger in one day. So you have to rest, and then the next day you're going to punch the glass again. Still no progress, but you got a little tiny bit stronger. You didn't notice it, but you got a tiny bit stronger. The next day, again, you're at it, punching the glass. It doesn't seem like anything's happening, but you're getting that tiny bit stronger. And then one day, so you keep at this for a long period of time, and then one day you punch the glass and all of a sudden a crack appears. That is how it feels to get better at shmups. It feels like you go many days practicing, trying, doing save states, doing load states, studying bosses, studying routes, doing all this stuff, and you don't really see much improvement, maybe a little bit here and there, but basically nothing. And then that all builds up, all these small improvements, all these small lessons that you learn that you may not even be totally conscious that you are learning. They all build up, and then one day you punch that glass and it cracked, and you're like, holy crap, I made a dent here or whatever. And then from there you feel a lot more motivation to keep doing it. And once you understand how this process works, you're going to be able to progress much more quickly, in my opinion. Basically what I'm saying is you need to have a bit of faith in your ability that you're not going to be able to see or measure for a while. But the thing about it is, in my experience, you need to be somewhat consistent in your efforts, and you need to be really diligent in what you're doing. So throwing in a casual credit every now and then, you may very gradually improve at the game and stuff like that, and improve at the genre. But I think if you want, what I'm trying to prescribe basically, is how do you get better at the genre fairly quickly, right? And so what I did with Dodonpachi was pretty insane. It was the grind of a lifetime, where I would play about 2 to 3 hours per day, sometimes more or sometimes less, but on average 2 to 3 hours per day, almost every day for about a year. I mean, it was a lot of time put into that game. It wasn't just like a weekend here or there. It was a real focused, sincere effort. And the thing about it is, and I talked to Prometheus about this as well, is he felt like to improve at the games more quickly, he found that really dedicating yourself to one game that is pushing you and challenging you improves you at the genre overall. That skill will transfer, not directly, but it will transfer. You'll be able to learn quicker because you're building up all these different lessons and things like that. And so there's some pitfalls that you can really run into that I want to warn you about that may be very discouraging. One of them is definitely sort of reset syndrome, where you or reset syndrome, or you feel like you're not improving at all, like consistency, skill wise, nerves, all that stuff. I've talked a little bit about nerves before, and I remember I had a lot of nerves, especially when I would start to get, to stage 2-5 in Dodonpachi. I mean, my heart rate was just going out of control. And what ended up helping me a lot, unfortunately, it's not the easiest method of doing things, but sheer exposure. And so that's another thing too. When you start getting really frustrated, you start getting really annoyed with the game, just keep in mind that every lesson, every failure is a step forward, because even if you fail, you are sort of habitualizing yourself to being in that position again. So let's say you're in 2-5, you get real nervous and you choke on the boss fight and it's basically over, right? Happened to me plenty of times. That feels like an absolute failure, and it is a failure, but the improvement came in that you have now had experience within that context, of being on a real run, being in a real situation, and then choking, so that the next time you do it, you have some lessons that you've learned that will help you sort of calm yourself a little bit and stuff like that. Basically, a lot of shmups are becoming habitualized to the stimulus, to the situation. And so for instance, when I started playing one loop games early on, like doing DOJ one alls and stuff like that, I would get really nervous in stages 4 and 5 because I felt like, oh, I've come so far, I don't want to blow it now. The thing about me playing Dodonpachi is now that I play 2 loop games, I rarely get as nervous during 1 loop games, because I've been really habitualized to the really strict punishments of Dodonpachi, and where basically you make a mistake and you lose half an hour worth of effort. And it's brutal, but it also does habitualize you and strengthen your skills. And that's why I think dedicating yourself to one game is a lot more effective than trying to just learn all these different games and stuff. Because when you start to optimize in one game, you're building your skills, you're building your precision overall, because one mistake becomes much more magnified when you have a larger goal, when you have a more dedicated goal. And so here's another thing I wanted to show you all, which comes from Prometheus. So in Full Extent of the Jam, he includes a link to this. This is a log of all his different attempts on his way to his PB in Dodonpachi, which is 500 something mil, 540 mil, somewhere in there. It's a 500 something mil score, an extremely good score. And so here, and he puts like little notes to himself on every run. Now, I am not nearly as organized and fastidious as Prometheus when it comes to this stuff. This really impresses me that he would do this. It shows a really methodical nature. I personally am not this methodical, but I mean, it's probably a good idea to do, not only to sort of reflect upon what happened, but also to create a log where if you want to go back and look at patterns of, okay, where am I failing? Where am I doing well? What should I be working on? This type of log will show what patterns are emerging. But another thing to keep an eye on is the fact that there's a lot of runs. So we're up to 250, 300, and he keeps like bad runs, loop clears, died before Guardian. I think that's the 1/6 boss. Died on the Guardian, so he didn't die on any of the 1/6 boss fights. True runs 7, 2 alls 2. See, so he's like really improving here. So here's 300. Keep going. These are full run attempts, and now we're up into the 400s, or 391. So, and I feel like Prometheus is a very, very fast learner and player, just based on the information he provides and stuff. I've already tried that many attempts in my life, and I have not nearly come near his score, but I think his practice methods are a bit more focused and methodical than mine have been. So definitely check out those guides from both Prometheus and Juju Kenobi as far as their practice methods. And also, I'm hoping that this video will help you sort of internalize and understand what the process of getting good is like. So let me just summarize it real quick. Number one, you need to create a meaningful goal, a goal that not only feels important, but also you feel guilty abandoning. Like, that's the key, really. That's what kept me going in Dononpachi. Was it wasn't just that I was just having this great time, because to be honest, when you start getting really deep into these grinds, it isn't a great time. It can be pretty frustrating and really hard, but you know, I think the payoff is definitely worth it. But at the time, and you'll want to change games, it's like, that's another thing that I really want to encourage you to try and resist, is try to resist changing games. If you have the discipline to just play that one game, that is the best way to do it. But if you're feeling really burned out on it, especially if you've already put a lot of time into the game, I think having a secondary game is a good way to go. That's why I ended up showing Gwenge in this video, even though my Gwenge gameplay is really awful at this point. It's because I'm still grinding away at Dononpachi, but I'm also going to learn Gwenge kind of on the side. So those are my two games I'm going for. And I also would recommend you to sort of publicly announce what your goal is. Because I think if you publicly announce it, create a little bit of pressure on yourself to follow through, right? Because you naturally create interest among your fellow players. Then you feel like, oh, okay, I've got to like back this up a bit. Like with my bet with Plasmo originally on my Dononpachi 2-all, I didn't win the bet, but the bet's existence definitely gave me a ton of motivation towards continuing towards the 2-all, especially when I got near the end and everyone was kind of like, no, you're not going to do it, you're not even close. That even gave me an extra sort of fire in my motivation, like, okay, no, I am close, you guys are underestimating me. So that's step one. Find that game that you're willing to put hundreds of hours into. Publicly state your goal if you are at all comfortable, but I would recommend it if possible. Publicly state, I'm going to do this, and then, you know, keep like a running log of what you're up to, your progress. Try to create a healthy sort of stepping stone of goals towards your main goal. Like, don't just sit down and say 600 mil in Dononpachi. Maybe try something like, okay, a 2-all in Dononpachi, or 200 mil, then we'll go to 300 mil, you know, like but try and have like a loftier goal, right? And then kind of work towards that. So that's step one. Step two is you need to establish some sort of consistent practice routine. I did 2 to 3 hours a day. That is a lot of shmupping, and I know a lot of people can't do that. But if you could just even do like 1 hour a day, that would actually be, in my opinion, better than having 4 hours on every Saturday, right? Like every Saturday you play 4 hours. It is better, both like for your neurology and just your brain, how your brain works, to do 1 hour each day, 4 days a week, rather than doing 4 hours in one sitting. So just try and establish a consistent time and practice routine that you are going to do this, and follow through. Because yeah, obviously if you're not following through, your skill is not going to increase as much. Step three is you need to start to identify what your issues are, as far as where are you dying and why, and then try and analyze what are the underlying things that make this come up. Like, are you having trouble understanding the routing? Are you having trouble just reacting to the bullets in the correct time? Are you having trouble understanding how patterns work, how to manipulate bosses, all that sort of stuff? And I'll get more into that specifically when you get into the routing video, but just try and identify what places are giving you trouble. And step four, which I give its own step because it's extremely important, is you need to sort of just have a bit of faith, because there's going to come times where you're going to be grinding and it doesn't seem like anything is happening. It feels like you're going nowhere. In fact, that may happen most of the time. You feel like most of the time you're playing, it's really not going anywhere. You need to have faith. because what's happening in your brain is you're making these small optimization here, and especially if you're watching for it, that really helps. But let's say you're, just passively playing the game or somewhat actively playing the game. Your brain is going to take these small optimizations and build them over time. And eventually those small optimizations get really consistent and second nature, and then all of a sudden you're clearing stage 3 consistently when before you weren't. I mean, it can happen in pretty quick bursts where everything just comes together all at once. Sometimes it can be a little more of a kind of gradual thing, it just depends, but just know that if you're doing all this time and you're putting in the hours but it doesn't seem like anything's happening, you just need to have some faith that it's going to happen. Step 5, of course, try and remain loyal to your single game if possible. Maybe if you needed to have a secondary game for your own sanity, do that, but try not to get too, oh, I'm playing this game this week, I'm playing this game this next week. If you're trying to improve specifically, right? If you just want to do that, that's fine, but I'm saying if you specifically want to improve, you need to stick to that one game. And then the final step, I think, is trying to set timelines for yourself. I think creating a timeline for yourself is important because it helps with the motivation, right? So publicly saying what you're going to do and also creating a timeline. You probably won't hit the timeline, but if you make the timeline something real and important to you in your head, you will feel that pressure to play the game and practice the game. You basically have to pressure yourself into doing it because, like I said, it's not going to be strictly fun all the time, and I think that might be discouraging for people to hear, but that is the truth, right? That's kind of how shmups work, is they literally can't be fun all the time. It takes some pain for the pleasure, right? That's why there really is no satisfaction like getting a really high goal in shmup, unless, because there's the pain, right? If there's no pain, it wouldn't have that same amount of satisfaction. So I'm hoping this has been a helpful sort of guide and talk about how you improve at the genre. It really is not a glamorous process. It really isn't. It's a pretty brutal, long, arduous process. But at the same time, if you're consistent, if you have faith in what you're doing, if you're staying true to the game that you're supposed to be playing and setting a goal that is pushing you, you are going to improve at the genre at a much faster rate than the typical sort of like going from game to game, learning a bit here and there, which you will improve at the genre doing that as well, but I don't think as nearly as significantly, because there's a lot of skills you don't learn by doing that, right? You don't learn how to control your nerves as well. You don't learn how to really hone in on optimization because it's not really required as much. You're not learning to really sort of build a thick skin when it comes to losing runs and growing that patience and all that stuff, right? All that stuff is really important, and I think you're not going to learn it unless you really buckle down and try for a higher goal than what you're normally capable of. So anyway, thanks so much for tuning in, and let me end this by thanking my patrons. So thank you to Dingo, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Brian Shiver, Porio, Dunpeel 2064, EC 2151, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Gus, Kiwi, Joe Angelo, John, Gameboy Guru, K, Quentin, Malaise, Mark Sloan, Martin Worrell, Maz, Maher Calendrian, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Okla Kugels, Parlar, Point Blank STG, Rhizosis, Smacky Factor, Sugumo, Turopon, Plasmo, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.